Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. Lords, Vassals, and Peasants. Understanding European Feudal Hierarchies. The feudal system that defined much of medieval Europe was neither simple nor static. It was an intricate network of relationships, obligations, and power dynamics that governed the lives of millions of people for centuries. To truly understand this world, you must begin at the very bottom with the peasantry and work your way upward through the layers of responsibility, service, and authority. Imagine yourself walking across a quiet village in 11th century France or England. The air is thick with the smell of smoke from cooking fires, the clatter of tools against soil, and the occasional lowing of cattle. Life here is unremarkable in a sense, almost boring, but it is precisely this monotony that underpins the survival of the feudal order. Peasants, often called serfs, were the backbone of this system. They did not own the land they farmed, rather they were tied to it through obligations to their lords. In exchange for protection, they provided labor, produce, or money. The manor, a self-contained estate, was the center of daily life. Peasants worked the lord's fields for a set number of days each week, tending to crops like wheat, rye, and barley. They maintained pastures, repaired buildings, and performed various menial tasks, all while trying to keep enough produce to feed their families. Failure to fulfill these obligations could mean harsh penalties, from fines to the forfeiture of property, and in some cases, physical punishment. Yet life was not entirely dictated by suffering. Within these obligations, peasants carved out spaces of autonomy. They grew small kitchen gardens, raised chickens, or foraged for wild herbs and fruits. Villages often had communal lands where families could graze animals or gather resources. Festivals, religious holidays, and market days provided brief, yet vital, respites from the relentless labor. Observing the rhythms of peasant life, you begin to see how survival depended not only on hard work, but also on careful negotiation with authority. Peasants were not passive victims, they were resilient and adaptable, finding ways to navigate the restrictions imposed by their lords. Above the peasantry were the knights and vassals, the intermediaries who upheld the feudal hierarchy and carried out the military obligations that maintained the lord's power. A vassal might be granted land, known as a fief, in return for loyalty and service to a lord. This service was often military in nature. Knights were expected to train rigorously, maintain arms and armor, and serve when called upon. Yet much of a knight's life involved managing the land granted to them, collecting rents, and overseeing the work of peasants. The ideal of chivalry, with its codes of honor and conduct, was layered atop the more practical demands of estate management. Lords, the upper tier of this pyramid, exercised legal, economic, and political authority over their domains. They held courts, resolved disputes, collected taxes, and directed military campaigns. Their lives were filled with obligations of their own to the monarch or higher-ranking noble from whom they held their lands. The power of a lord was therefore both absolute in daily matters and constrained by loyalty to others, creating a delicate balance. From the outside, feudal life might seem rigidly hierarchical, but within it existed subtle negotiations, alliances, and tensions that shaped daily existence. Feudalism was not uniform across Europe. While the basic structure, lords, vassals, and peasants, remained consistent, local conditions produced significant variation. In some regions, lords were absentee landowners, living far from their estates and leaving management to stewards. In others, lords resided within their manors, closely supervising labor and maintaining direct influence over daily life. Some regions imposed heavier labor obligations, while others allowed peasants more freedom to cultivate personal plots or engage in trade. These differences created a patchwork of experiences, reflecting the adaptability of feudalism to geography, politics, and social expectations. The importance of ceremony and ritual cannot be overlooked. Homage, oaths of fealty, and the formal granting of fiefs were carefully choreographed events that reinforced hierarchy and loyalty. A vassal kneeling before a lord, swearing obedience, was not merely a symbolic act, it was a legally binding commitment that structured relationships and codified rights and duties. These rituals, repeated across generations, embedded the logic of feudal society deeply within the culture, ensuring continuity even amidst crises, such as famine, war, or disease. Feudalism was also deeply intertwined with religion. The church held significant land, and clergy often acted as lords, imposing tithes and participating in feudal networks. Monasteries and abbeys managed estates, collected rents, and influenced the economy of surrounding villages. Religion provided not only moral authority but also practical administration, as priests often mediated disputes and recorded obligations. The rhythm of religious life, daily prayers, holy days, and festivals structured the calendar of labor and leisure, tying spiritual duties to temporal ones. Yet beneath this structured, seemingly stable system, uncertainty and instability constantly threatened the social order. Harvest failures, local conflicts, and the ambitions of more powerful lords could disrupt daily life. Peasants faced the constant threat of famine, while knights might be called to fight in distant wars, leaving estates vulnerable. Even lords had to navigate succession disputes, rebellions, and shifting allegiances. This underlying fragility, often invisible to an outsider, was the hidden tension that animated feudal life. In observing these structures, you might ask, how did ordinary people experience power, obligation, and survival within such a rigid system? Did they feel trapped, or did they find ways to thrive quietly? How much control did they truly have over their destinies, and how much was dictated by the invisible architecture of feudal hierarchy? These questions linger as we turn our attention to the next level of society, the intermediaries, the vassals and knights, whose actions both enforced and challenged the system. Feudal Europe, in its seeming monotony, reveals a complex interplay of power, obligation, survival, and resilience. Every plow turned, every oath sworn, every harvest gathered was part of a delicate network that maintained an entire society. And yet, the true character of this world, its strengths, weaknesses, and the lived experience of its inhabitants can only be glimpsed by moving deeper into the stories of those who occupied each tier of the hierarchy. How did these obligations shape choices, loyalties, and even the course of European history itself? That question hangs in the air as we prepare to move forward. As you step up the hierarchy from the peasant fields into the halls of the manor, you begin to see how feudalism functioned as more than just a social contract. It was a system of interdependent obligations, military readiness, and localized governance. The peasants' labor underpinned the system, but it was the vassals and knights who acted as the gears and levers, ensuring that the lord's authority extended beyond the manor and into the broader political landscape. A vassal's life was a careful balance between loyalty to a lord and the management of his own landholdings. When a noble granted a fief, it came with rights as well as responsibilities. These were codified in formal ceremonies of homage and fealty, where the vassal knelt before the lord, swearing allegiance and promising service. While the rituals themselves may seem ceremonial, they carried legal weight. Breaching this oath could lead to the confiscation of land, loss of income, or even armed conflict. The vassal, therefore, lived with both opportunity and constant risk. His social and economic position depended on maintaining the delicate equilibrium of service and loyalty. The vassal's primary obligation was military. In a world without standing armies, knights and their entourages were the defenders of the realm, ready to respond when called upon. Knights trained relentlessly in horsemanship, swordsmanship, and tactics, but much of this preparation occurred in the fields and forests near their estates, where mock battles and exercises kept skills honed. They also maintained small retinue squires and other attendants who lived on the fief, and performed daily tasks to ensure the knight's readiness. The martial obligations could be grueling, especially during periods of conflict when lords summoned their vassals for extended campaigns, leaving estates temporarily in the hands of stewards. Yet the life of a knight or vassal was not purely martial. Most of their time was spent managing their lands, overseeing peasants, collecting rents, and adjudicating disputes. The lord of the manor relied on the vassal to maintain productivity, enforce rules, and ensure the flow of goods and labor to the upper echelons. In many ways, a vassal's power was grounded not in battlefield heroics, but in their ability to organize and exploit human and material resources. This duality, warrior and estate manager, defined the medieval aristocratic identity. Consider the everyday workings of a medium-sized fief. Peasants owed labor or produce, sometimes measured in precise amounts, a certain number of bushels of wheat, a defined portion of their herd, or specified days of labor. Vassals monitored this meticulously, often walking the boundaries of fields, inspecting crops and recording obligations. They resolved petty disputes among peasants, such as disagreements over shared water mills or grazing rights, and maintained infrastructure, like bridges or irrigation ditches. Life in these interactions may appear mundane, endless counting, negotiating, and record-keeping, but it was essential to sustaining the feudal order. The vassal's oversight transformed labor into wealth and wealth into power. Knights were also deeply embedded in the culture of honor and social expectation. Chivalry was more than an abstract ideal, it was a practical code shaping behavior. Knights were expected to protect the weak, honor their word, and uphold the reputation of their lord. Yet this code often conflicted with the harsh realities of life: taxes, military levies, and conflicts between lords. A knight might have to enforce strict obligations on peasants while simultaneously living under the constraints imposed by a more powerful noble. This tension between moral ideal and practical necessity defined much of the aristocratic experience. Feudal power was not simply vertical, it flowed horizontally as well, through networks of alliances and marriages. Marriages between vassal families could consolidate landholdings, create mutual defense pacts, or strengthen political influence. Similarly, a lord might redistribute fiefs strategically, rewarding loyalty or weakening potential rivals. The system was, in essence, a web of reciprocal obligations and interwoven loyalties. Betrayal, mismanagement, or shifting allegiances could destabilize an entire region. Even a seemingly minor dispute between a vassal and a neighbor could escalate into open conflict, drawing in armies and disrupting the lives of peasants who had no say in the larger political game. Religious life intertwined deeply with this hierarchy. Many knights and vassals were devout Christians, and the church provided moral justification for both social obligations and military campaigns. Tithes, donations, and the sponsorship of monasteries were integral to demonstrating piety. Knights often participated in religious festivals, processions, and pilgrimage, reinforcing the social order through shared ritual. The church also played a judicial role, mediating disputes, recording contracts, and legitimizing power. In some cases, clergy acted as advisors to lords, blending spiritual guidance with practical governance. Beyond governance and ritual, the physical environment shaped every action. Forests, rivers, and mountains defined the boundaries of estates and influenced agricultural output. A vassal's success depended not only on skillful administration, but also on understanding the land, weather, and seasonal rhythms. Crop rotation, livestock management, and resource allocation were constant concerns. A poor harvest could ripple across the system, reducing food for peasants, diminishing the wealth of the lord, and straining the vassal's ability to meet obligations. Survival in this context required vigilance, foresight, and often adaptability. In this section, we see that vassals and knights were neither wholly powerful nor entirely free. Their lives were enmeshed in obligations that defined their social, economic, and military existence. Their influence over peasants was considerable, yet their own security relied on adherence to higher authority. Feudalism, in practice, was a delicate equilibrium, a combination of hierarchical structure, personal loyalty, and mutual dependency. The system endured precisely because each participant, from the lord to the lowest knight, had a role that was both necessary and constrained. Yet questions remain. How did these obligations shape the larger course of European history? Did the constant demands on knights and vassals encourage innovation or limit it? How did the social pressures and limitations of feudalism affect the choices of ordinary peasants, shaping their resilience and strategies for survival? The story of feudal Europe is not complete without examining the human consequences of these obligations, the subtle ways that power, labor, and loyalty intersected in everyday life. This unresolved tension between structure and agency, obligation and freedom, duty and survival sets the stage for the final section of this story, where we will explore how these dynamics came to a head, influencing both the decline of feudalism and the transformation of European society. As we move toward the final layers of understanding feudal Europe, the picture becomes both clearer and more complicated. The system, so meticulously organized through obligations, hierarchies, and rituals, was not invincible. In fact, it was precisely the rigidities that had allowed it to function for centuries that eventually exposed it to pressures it could not always withstand. By the 13th and 14th centuries, cracks began to appear, revealing how intertwined and fragile the lives of lords, vassals, knights, and peasants had become. One major pressure came from economics. While the labor of peasants supported the system, population growth, agricultural limitations, and climate fluctuations periodically strained resources. A poor harvest could destabilize a manor, leaving peasants struggling to meet their obligations. In turn, lords and vassals faced shortfalls in revenue, undermining their ability to maintain fortifications, pay retainers, or fund military campaigns. Repeated cycles of scarcity fostered tensions between social classes, sometimes erupting into localized revolts. These uprisings were rarely revolutionary. They did not aim to dismantle feudalism, but they reflected the persistent human desire to resist burdens that threatened survival. Warfare, too, reshaped the structure of power. Knights trained for combat, yet warfare evolved in ways that gradually diminished the strategic value of individual fiefs. The introduction of longbows, crossbows, and later gunpowder challenged the dominance of armored cavalry. Armies increasingly relied on professional soldiers and mercenaries, reducing the importance of feudal levies. For vassals, this shift meant that military prowess alone no longer guaranteed social influence or security. Lords had to navigate a changing political landscape where loyalty, land ownership, and wealth were still essential, but martial skill was only one factor in survival. The social pressures on peasants also intensified. While some regions allowed for negotiation and small freedoms, others saw increasing burdens as lords sought to extract every possible resource. Obligations might shift from labor to money payments, altering the rhythm of daily life and the distribution of wealth. Peasants who successfully navigated these pressures through careful management of gardens, livestock, or craft skills found avenues for survival and modest prosperity. Others, however, suffered under heavy taxation or rigid demands, their resilience tested to its limits. Religion continued to play a dual role. The church provided moral justification for feudal obligations, yet it also offered channels of refuge, advocacy, and mediation. Monks and priests often acted as intermediaries, recording agreements and overseeing charitable support. Pilgrimages and religious festivals allowed peasants brief relief from toil, and reminded everyone in the hierarchy that they were part of a cosmic order larger than the manor. Yet even within this spiritual framework, obligations remained heavy. The tithe, a tenth of all produce, was non-negotiable, reminding peasants of their subordination to both lord and divine authority. Despite these pressures, feudalism proved remarkably adaptable. Alliances through marriage, redistribution of fiefs, and flexible interpretation of obligations allowed lords and vassals to respond to crises. Political savvy and personal relationships often mattered more than brute force. A lord who cultivated loyalty through fair treatment and careful stewardship could maintain stability, while a harsh or inattentive lord risked revolt or the erosion of his power. Similarly, a vassal who balanced the demands of higher lords with the needs of peasants could preserve both wealth and influence. The system survived because each participant had a role that was essential yet negotiable, a delicate network maintained through both obligation and subtle personal agency. The culmination of these dynamics became especially evident during periods of crisis. The Black Death of the mid-14th century, which killed an estimated one-third of Europe's population, revealed the vulnerabilities of the feudal system. Labor shortages gave peasants unprecedented leverage, allowing them to demand higher wages or better conditions. Some lords attempted to enforce pre-plague obligations through legislation, but such efforts were often unsuccessful, reflecting the shifting balance of power. What had once been an unbreakable hierarchy showed itself to be flexible under extreme circumstances. Even as feudalism waned, its imprint on European society endured. The system shaped the development of legal codes, land tenure practices, and social hierarchies that persisted for centuries. Estates and manorial boundaries often outlasted the obligations they represented, influencing taxation, governance, and community identity. The legacy of feudal Europe is not one of dramatic revolution or spectacular collapse, but of slow transformation, in which ordinary lives, peasants tending fields, vassals managing fiefs, knights performing duties, accumulated to produce profound, long-lasting societal change. In reflecting on feudal hierarchies, you can see how the balance of obligation, loyalty, and survival shaped every level of society. Peasants endured repetitive labor and strict oversight, yet found resilience and agency in small acts of self-determination. Vassals and knights balanced martial and managerial duties, navigating a web of loyalties that demanded both skill and prudence. Lords wielded authority, but relied on the cooperation and compliance of those beneath them. Together, these interactions created a stable yet dynamic system, capable of enduring centuries but never immune to challenge or change. So as you imagine yourself walking across a medieval village once more, or observing the knights and lords at work in the manor hall, consider the broader question: how did the cumulative decisions of ordinary people, decisions about labor, loyalty, and survival, shape the trajectory of European history? Feudalism was not just a system imposed from above. It was a lived experience, constantly negotiated and subtly reshaped by the actions of countless individuals. And in that interplay, you glimpse the quiet power of the ordinary, the way boring details of daily life can ripple across centuries, leaving an enduring mark on the world. Story 2: Calpulli and Tribute, the foundations of Aztec society. If you step into the Aztec world of the 15th century, you enter a realm that, like feudal Europe, is organized around obligations and hierarchies, but with an entirely different rhythm, logic, and set of institutions. The foundation of Aztec society was the Calpulli, often translated as clan or neighborhood, but in practice, a multifaceted unit that combined kinship, labor, and political responsibilities. These were not just social groups. They were the engines of production, education, and tribute collection that enabled the Aztec Empire to expand and sustain itself. Imagine yourself arriving in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, on a busy market day. The city sprawls across a series of islands in Lake Texcoco, connected by causeways and canals. Smoke from cooking fires mingles with the scent of maize tortillas baking on clay griddles, while merchants shout the prices of cacao beans, chilies, and colorful feathers. Around the city, small canals and canal-sides terraces are worked by farmers who belong to cowpuli scattered across the region. Each cowpuli is responsible for the land it cultivates, the houses its members inhabit, and the tribute it must provide to the empire. Unlike the largely static peasant villages of Europe, the cowpuli is a dynamic organizational unit, blending the domestic, economic, and civic. At its core, a cowpuli functions as a labor-sharing community. Families within a cowpuli collectively farm the land, organize irrigation, and manage the plots allocated to each household. Labor is divided by age, gender, and skill. Men typically handled heavier tasks clearing fields, constructing terraces, and producing tools, while women prepared food, wove textiles, and managed domestic gardens. Children began learning their duties early, shadowing adults to acquire skills essential for survival. Education was embedded in daily life. Knowledge about agriculture, ritual, and social norms was transmitted through practical work rather than formal schools. Tribute, however, is the defining feature of the cowpuli's relationship to the Aztec state. The Aztec rulers did not directly farm or manage every plot of land. Instead, they relied on an intricate system of obligations. Each cowpuli was assessed a quota of goods: maize, beans, cotton, cacao, or crafted items like obsidian blades, and delivered these to the empire's administrators. Tribute collection was regular and highly organized, often recorded by scribes using pictographic codices. Failure to meet obligations could bring punishment, including increased demands or coercive labor, and in extreme cases, the threat of military action. In this sense, the cowpuli operates both as a productive community and a mechanism of state control, linking the local to the imperial. Within each cowpuli, governance is remarkably decentralized, yet structured. Elders or elected leaders coordinate labor, adjudicate disputes, and organize tribute deliveries. These leaders maintain relationships with higher authorities, such as city administrators or military commanders, acting as intermediaries between the people and the empire. The system is designed to integrate ordinary households into the broader machinery of power without overwhelming them with direct supervision. Everyone understands their role, but flexibility exists to adjust to local conditions: floods, poor harvests, or population shifts, demonstrating the adaptability of the Aztec administrative network. Religion permeates every aspect of life, just as it did in feudal Europe, but with a distinct emphasis on the interdependence of humans and the divine. Daily offerings, communal ceremonies, and participation in temple festivals ensure the favor of the gods, who are believed to maintain cosmic balance and agricultural fertility. Children learn early that their labor, from planting maize to weaving textiles, is part of a spiritual obligation as well as a civic one. Unlike Europe, where religious authority is mediated through a separate clergy class, in Aztec society, ritual is deeply integrated into the cowpuli's everyday work, creating a seamless fusion of economy, governance, and spirituality. The physical environment shapes every decision. The Aztec capital is located in a lake system, requiring ingenuity to farm and expand urban spaces. Chinempas, or floating gardens, are constructed to maximize arable land, providing rich harvests that sustain the dense population. Canal networks facilitate transportation and trade, connecting the city to surrounding cowpuli. Labor is intensive, coordinated by local leaders, and essential to sustaining both the community and the empire. Survival is never passive. Every person contributes to a carefully balanced system, and the productivity of each cowpuli directly affects the stability of the state. Education and apprenticeship are embedded in the social structure. Boys train for military or administrative roles, while girls learn household management, craftwork, and ritual responsibilities. Knowledge is transmitted orally and through hands-on practice, ensuring continuity and cohesion within the cowpuli. Unlike the European system, where literacy is often confined to clergy and nobility, Aztec knowledge is widespread, practical, and integrated into social life. Each member understands not only their personal duties, but also how their work contributes to the community and the empire at large. Yet despite this apparent order, the system carries tensions. Tribute demands can be heavy, and compliance is monitored rigorously. Households must balance immediate survival needs with imperial obligations. Agricultural failures, disease, or conflict can strain resources, testing the resilience of both Calpuli and individual families. Local leaders must navigate these pressures, managing both human labor and the risk of rebellion. The Aztec system, like feudal Europe, depends on the careful alignment of authority, obligation, and cooperation, but with a distinctly collective and centralized structure. In contemplating the Calpuli, one begins to see the broader logic of the Aztec Empire. It is a society in which ordinary households are integral to imperial strength, in which labor, ritual, and political organization intersect seamlessly, and in which local autonomy coexists with overarching control. The empire thrives not through coercion alone, but through the careful coordination of everyday life, making the mundane planting maize, weaving cloth, delivering tribute essential to the functioning of one of the most remarkable civilizations in the Americas. And yet, questions linger. How did ordinary people experience these obligations day to day? Did the intertwining of ritual, labor, and state control foster a sense of participation, or did it feel like constant surveillance and demand? How did local leaders manage tensions between survival and tribute, and what happened when expectations were not met? These questions hang in the air as we prepare to explore the deeper mechanisms of tribute enforcement, social mobility, and imperial expansion in the next section. As you move beyond the village-level Calpuli, you begin to perceive the larger machinery of the Aztec Empire. Tribute was not simply a symbolic act of loyalty, it was the lifeblood of imperial power, sustaining armies, temples, and urban centers. Unlike European feudalism, where obligations were often negotiated locally and loosely enforced, the Aztec state relied on meticulous records, rigorous collection, and when necessary, coercion. This combination of organization and oversight shaped every aspect of life, from the labor of peasants to the responsibilities of local leaders and military commanders. Each Calpuli was assessed its quota according to its population, agricultural productivity, and craft output. These quotas were not arbitrary. Aztec scribes maintained detailed pictographic codices recording the type and quantity of tribute expected. Payment schedules were exacting, and failure to comply could provoke a range of consequences, from additional levies to punitive expeditions. Tribute inspectors, often accompanied by warriors, visited villages to ensure delivery. Their arrival was a moment of anxiety and preparation. Peasants had to gather produce, textiles, or crafted goods, and leaders had to verify that quotas were met. These visits reinforced imperial authority while demonstrating the reach of the state into the lives of ordinary people. The tribute system was remarkably diverse. Agricultural goods such as maize, beans, chili peppers, and amaranth were common, but tribute also included luxury items: cacao, jaguar skins, fine feathers, and obsidian blades. Skilled craftspeople contributed textiles, pottery, or jewelry. In this way, the Aztec Empire tapped into both the subsistence and economic capacities of its subjects, ensuring that the capital and the elite were supplied with essential foodstuffs, material wealth, and ceremonial items. Ordinary people participated in a network that extended from their small village plots to the palace markets of Tenochtitlan. Leadership within each Calpuli played a crucial role in navigating these demands. Elders or elected leaders organized labor for tribute production, coordinated delivery schedules, and mediated conflicts that arose under the strain of these obligations. They were responsible for translating imperial requirements into local action, ensuring both compliance and the continued survival of the household members. This balancing act required skill, diplomacy, and sometimes ingenuity. Leaders had to anticipate shortages, manage disputes over resources, and prevent unrest, all while maintaining the legitimacy of their authority within the calpuli. Military service was often intertwined with tribute obligations. Young men from the calpuli were expected to train for war, learning strategies, weapon use, and the discipline necessary to serve as soldiers in campaigns of conquest. These campaigns, in turn, expanded the empire and increased the flow of tribute from newly subjugated regions. Warfare was thus directly connected to daily life, creating a feedback loop in which labor and tribute funded military campaigns, and military campaigns secured more labor and tribute. The empire's success depended on the constant alignment of these elements, a system as efficient as it was demanding. For peasants and commoners, daily life involved careful time management and resource allocation. Agricultural cycles dictated work schedules. Planting, weeding, and harvesting followed the rhythms of the seasons. Food had to be set aside for household consumption, seed preservation, and tribute delivery. Craft production required dedicated labor hours. Families learned early that failure to meet obligations could result in both immediate hardship and long-term consequences for the community. Yet within these constraints, people developed strategies for survival, sharing surplus, diversifying crops, or producing high-quality crafts that could be used to fulfill tribute quotas efficiently. Survival depended on ingenuity as much as labor. Trade and local markets offered additional flexibility. While tribute to the empire was mandatory, local economies allowed families to exchange goods, acquire rare items, or obtain what was missing from their own production. Market participation required knowledge of negotiation, valuation, and transport logistics, skills that enhanced household resilience. These economic activities were closely observed but generally tolerated by authorities, as long as tribute obligations were met. The Aztec Empire thus combined strict control with pragmatic tolerance, allowing ordinary people some latitude within a highly organized system. Religion reinforced the political structure. Tribute goods were not merely economic, they were often intended for temple use, feeding priests, supporting festivals, and ensuring divine favor. Ritual obligations intertwined with labor. Preparing maize for the temple or weaving textiles for offerings was both an act of civic duty and spiritual devotion. The daily rhythm of work and ritual created a cultural framework in which imperial obligations were experienced as an extension of cosmic order, binding people to the state and to the gods. Yet tensions were inevitable. The enforcement of tribute, while systematic, could be harsh. Inspectors might confiscate goods, and military interventions could punish noncompliance with violence. Local leaders had to maintain legitimacy and ensure that households remained cooperative, balancing the needs of the empire with the welfare of their constituents. Peasants faced the constant challenge of meeting demands while sustaining their families, a delicate tension that defined much of everyday life. The resilience of communities was tested repeatedly, and survival often depended on careful negotiation, ingenuity, and collective effort. The tribute system also fostered mobility and prestige within the empire. Households that excelled in production or craft could gain recognition, while military service offered opportunities for advancement. Merit, skill, and reliability became valuable assets in a system that rewarded contribution to the collective effort. While the hierarchy was strict, individual and communal performance mattered, providing subtle incentives that reinforced social cohesion and strengthened the state. In reflecting on these dynamics, it becomes clear that the Aztec tribute system was not merely an extractive mechanism. It was a framework connecting families, communities, and the state, an integration of labor, ritual, education, and military service. Ordinary people were not passive cogs, they were active participants navigating obligations, survival, and opportunity. Their daily decisions, their labor, and their ingenuity formed the backbone of one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian empires in the Americas. Yet questions remain unresolved. How did the tribute system evolve as the empire expanded? How did ordinary households respond when obligations became overwhelming, or when imperial expansion brought new peoples under Aztec control? And how did the interplay between tribute, military service, and local leadership shape the resilience and eventual vulnerabilities of the empire? These questions prepare us to explore the final section of this story, where the consequences of tribute enforcement, social mobility, and imperial strategy come to light. By the mid-15th century, the Aztec Empire had grown into a vast and complex network of tribute-paying communities, extending far beyond Tenochtitlan to encompass dozens of subject cities and regions. The Calpulli remained the foundational unit, but as the empire expanded, the system of tribute faced new pressures. The demands on households increased, the logistics of collection became more complex, and the stakes for failure grew higher. Understanding these dynamics illuminates both the strength and fragility of Aztec society, as well as the lived experience of ordinary people under imperial rule. The expansion of the empire was driven by a combination of military conquest and strategic alliances. Newly subjugated regions were required to join the tribute system, integrating their labor, agricultural produce, and crafts into the broader network. Tribute inspectors, sometimes accompanied by soldiers, traveled long distances to collect goods and ensure compliance. For many households, this was a profound adjustment. New expectations, unfamiliar authorities, and increased production demands challenged traditional ways of life. Local leaders, already balancing their responsibilities to the Calpulli and the state, were tasked with managing these transitions, ensuring that tribute flowed smoothly while maintaining local stability. Military service remained closely intertwined with tribute obligations. Young men from Calpulli were often conscripted to fight in campaigns aimed at enforcing compliance or expanding the empire's reach. Success in battle could enhance a family's prestige and result in material rewards, while failure might lead to harsher obligations or social stigma. The Aztec system thus created a cycle in which labor, tribute, and military service were mutually reinforcing. Ordinary households experienced these cycles directly, as the demands of cultivation, craft production, and training were compounded by the need to supply soldiers and sustain the empire's infrastructure. Despite the pressures, the tribute system also offered opportunities for advancement and recognition. Households that excelled in craft production or agriculture could gain status within the Calpulli, and warriors who distinguished themselves in battle could rise in social standing. Religious contributions, such as producing fine textiles or participating in temple rituals, reinforced both civic and spiritual prestige. Merit mattered, and the Aztec system recognized skill and reliability, integrating incentives into a structure that otherwise relied on obligation. This dual emphasis on duty and reward helped maintain cohesion across a diverse and expansive empire. Yet the system was not without tension. Heavy tribute demands could strain households, especially in times of poor harvests, disease, or local conflict. Calpulli leaders were caught between the needs of their people and the demands of the empire, mediating disputes and negotiating what was feasible. The balance was precarious. Excessive enforcement could provoke resistance, while leniency risked imperial reprisal. Peasants and commoners had to navigate these pressures carefully, often using ingenuity and cooperation to meet obligations without jeopardizing survival. In this way, daily life was a constant negotiation, balancing personal needs with collective responsibilities. The tribute system's integration with religion amplified both its power and its psychological weight. Offerings to temples and participation in rituals were framed not only as spiritual duties, but also as civic obligations. Families understood that failure to contribute adequately could invite divine as well as political consequences. In practice, this meant that labor and tribute were experienced as morally significant acts, reinforcing obedience while fostering communal identity. Spiritual and temporal authority were inseparable, creating a system in which the mundane tasks of planting, weaving, or delivering goods were elevated to acts of cosmic importance. Expansion, however, exposed vulnerabilities. As the empire grew, the administrative and logistical challenges multiplied. Distant regions were harder to monitor, and tribute inspectors faced resistance or logistical barriers. Local leaders sometimes manipulated records, negotiated partial payments, or delayed deliveries, testing the limits of imperial control. These strains foreshadowed the empire's eventual fragility, demonstrating that even the most meticulously organized system depended on human compliance, local knowledge, and careful negotiation. The legacy of the Calpuli and the tribute system extends far beyond their immediate function. They created a social and economic framework that supported urban centers, armies, and monumental architecture. They fostered skills, education, and civic responsibility within households, linking ordinary lives to the broader narrative of empire. At the same time, they reveal the constant tension between state authority and local agency, between obligation and survival. Ordinary people, farmers, artisans, soldiers were not passive subjects. Their decisions, labor, and resilience shaped the empire's capacity to expand, sustain itself, and endure crises. In reflecting on the Aztec system, you can see parallels and contrasts with other hierarchical societies, such as feudal Europe. Both relied on structured obligations, layered authority, and labor as the foundation of power. Yet the Aztec system's integration of kinship, civic duty, and ritual created a more centralized and organized network, in which daily life was both a personal and communal contribution to imperial strength. Success depended on the collective efforts of many, and the resilience of ordinary households was as critical to empire as the valor of warriors or the decrees of rulers. And yet, the story raises enduring questions. How did the pressures of tribute shape innovation, adaptation, and social cohesion? What strategies did families develop to manage scarcity, labor, and compliance? And how did the intricate balance of obligations ultimately influence the empire's ability to resist external threats, such as the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors centuries later? The answers to these questions reveal not just the functioning of a historical empire, but the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to navigate complex systems of power, obligation, and survival. Story 3. Life on the Manor, Daily Survival in Medieval Europe. If you step onto a medieval manor, the first thing you notice is the steady rhythm of labor and the hum of practical activity. Unlike the grand tales of knights and kings, the manor's life is quiet, repetitive, and yet profoundly essential. Here, ordinary peasants and serfs sustain the entire social hierarchy, their work the invisible foundation upon which lords, vassals, and knights depend. To understand medieval Europe, you must begin with these rhythms. The cycles of planting and harvest, the repair of fences and roads, the careful management of livestock, and the navigation of obligations to lords who control the land. Manors varied in size, but the structure was generally consistent. At the center stood the lord's hall or keep, a solid building of stone or timber, commanding views over fields and cottages. Surrounding it were peasant dwellings, barns, workshops, and fields divided according to use. The lord's domain, land reserved for his personal use, was cultivated directly by peasants, often for multiple days each week. Remaining plots were assigned to families for subsistence, but obligations still tied them to the manor: rents, labor, and the supply of goods to the lord's household. Every day was a negotiation between survival and duty, a balance maintained through custom, law, and local negotiation. Work was dictated by the seasons. Spring brought plowing and sowing, summer, weeding and tending, autumn, harvesting and storing grain, winter, maintenance, repairing fences, tools and buildings, and caring for livestock indoors. Labor was physically demanding, requiring strength, endurance, and knowledge of the land. Tools were simple wooden plows, hoes, sickles, but used with skill honed over generations. Mistakes could reduce yield, which in turn affected food security and the ability to fulfill obligations to the Lord. Survival depended on careful planning, shared effort, and a detailed understanding of natural cycles. Life on the manor was not only laborious but regulated by obligations. Serfs owed a fixed number of days to work on the Lord's fields, often 6 or more each week during peak seasons. They also contributed a portion of their harvest, paid rents in money or in kind, and performed specialized labor such as milling grain, maintaining roads, or assisting in construction. These obligations were codified in local custom, sometimes reinforced through manorial courts, overseen by stewards or bailiffs who ensured compliance. Peasants learned to navigate this system with skill, timing their work and household tasks to avoid fines or penalties while still maintaining food and shelter for their families. Within households, labor was divided by gender and age. Men undertook heavier field work, plowing, hauling, and repairing infrastructure, while women managed food preparation, animal care, textile production, and child-rearing. Children contributed from a young age, fetching water, tending animals, or helping sow seeds. Knowledge and skill were transmitted experientially. A child learned by watching and imitating, gradually taking on responsibility. Education in reading and writing was rare, generally confined to clergy, but practical knowledge was extensive and vital to survival. The physical environment shaped every decision. Soil quality, water access, and local climate determined which crops could thrive. Villagers learned to rotate fields, manage manure, and preserve seeds to maximize productivity. Livestock cows, pigs, sheep, chickens provided food, labor, and materials like wool and leather. Even the layout of cottages and fields was optimized for efficiency, reflecting centuries of accumulated experience. Survival was as much about understanding the land as about performing labor. Communal practices mitigated risk and strengthened social cohesion. Villages often shared meadows, pastures, and forests, coordinating grazing rights, wood collection, and hunting. Markets allowed exchange of goods, supplementing household production. Festivals and holy days provided not only spiritual relief, but also crucial opportunities for trade, socializing, and cultural continuity. These practices created interdependence within the village, binding ordinary people together in networks of support and cooperation. Yet tension was constant. Peasants were bound to the land and the Lord's authority, limited in their freedom of movement. Heavy obligations, poor harvests, or local mismanagement could cause hardship or famine. The threat of fines, eviction, or punishment under the Lord's court loomed over daily life. Negotiation, compromise, and community strategies became essential for survival. Ordinary people developed subtle techniques, bartering goods, carefully timing labor contributions, and maintaining good relations with overseers. These mundane but precise strategies often determined whether a family thrived or barely survived. Religion infused daily existence. Villagers observed saints' days, attended Mass, and participated in rituals that marked the passage of the agricultural calendar. Church obligations, like tithes, commonly a tenth of produce added to the workload, yet provided communal support, spiritual guidance, and education in basic literacy for some children. Priests often acted as mediators, recording obligations and resolving disputes, bridging the spiritual and practical aspects of life. Rituals, work, and survival were tightly woven together, each reinforcing the other. In observing life on the manor, you realize that what might appear mundane, planting seeds, weaving cloth, repairing a roof, was in fact the mechanism through which the entire feudal system functioned. Ordinary labor sustained lords, vassals, and knights. It maintained social order, provided security, and enabled military campaigns. Yet it was also a life of resilience, adaptability, and subtle negotiation, where every choice mattered and small decisions had cumulative consequences across generations. And yet questions linger. How did peasants cope when obligations became overwhelming? How did they balance household survival with the constant demands of lords? And how did their collective efforts, labor, and ingenuity influence the larger trajectory of European society? These questions invite us to examine the broader interactions on the manor, where work, power, and survival intersect in both predictable and unexpected ways. Having seen the daily rhythm of peasant life on the manor, it becomes clear that survival depended not only on labor and skill, but also on navigating a complex web of obligations to lords, stewards, and local officials. The manor was not a static system. It was a living ecosystem of authority, negotiation, and subtle power dynamics. Each participant, from the humblest peasant to the overseeing bailiff, had a role in maintaining the balance between productivity and control. The steward or bailiff, often appointed by the lord, was the primary intermediary between the lord and the peasantry. He supervised the day-to-day work on the domain, ensured that labor obligations were met, collected rents, and held minor court sessions to resolve disputes. For peasants, the bailiff was both a source of authority and a potential ally. Clever negotiation, careful compliance, or even subtle bribery could influence how strictly obligations were enforced. Success in these interactions often determined whether a household could retain enough produce for family consumption while fulfilling the lord's demands. Seasonal work intensified these interactions. During plowing and sowing, overseers might ride the fields, checking lines, inspecting the quality of work, and ensuring that peasants were meeting quotas. Mistakes could be punished, but allowances were sometimes made for local conditions. Late rains, pest infestations, or difficult soil could affect output. Peasants who understood these subtleties learned when to push labor, when to plead for leniency, and how to maintain goodwill while still protecting their family's needs. In this way, survival required both physical skill and social intelligence. Within households, labor division remained critical. Men, women, and older children worked together in highly coordinated patterns. Men often focused on plowing, tending animals, and heavy construction, while women processed food, spun wool, wove cloth, and maintained gardens. Children gradually took on responsibilities appropriate to their age, learning farming, animal husbandry, and craft skills. Education was practical and experiential, transmitted orally and by doing. Unlike formal schooling, these skills were essential to both survival and the ability to negotiate obligations effectively. The manor itself functioned as a microeconomy. Crops, livestock, and crafts produced by peasants were used not only to feed their families, but also to supply the lord's household. Tools, clothing, and food were often bartered or exchanged within the village, supplementing meager earnings and providing a buffer against scarcity. Mills, ovens, and communal pasture lands were managed collectively, with rules enforced by local elders or overseers. Cooperation was essential. Failure by one household could ripple outward, affecting neighbors and the larger community. The interconnectedness of life on the manor meant that individual survival was inseparable from collective responsibility. Conflicts were inevitable, and manorial courts played a central role in managing disputes. These courts handled everything from land boundaries and inheritance issues to complaints about labor obligations or fines for theft. Peasants often presented cases with careful attention to custom and precedent, while stewards interpreted and enforced the lord's authority. These interactions reveal the subtle agency of ordinary people. Even within a rigid hierarchy, knowledge of local laws, negotiation skills, and social alliances could influence outcomes. Survival was therefore both practical and strategic, blending labor with diplomacy. Religious life reinforced these social structures. Church attendance, participation in festivals, and observance of saints' days structured the calendar and provided psychological relief. Tithes, though burdensome, were also a form of social insurance. Clergy often mediated disputes, offered charity, and recorded vital agreements. Rituals connected work, obligation, and belief, creating a moral framework that legitimized both labor and authority. Peasants experienced their labor not only as economic necessity, but also as participation in a divinely sanctioned social order. Feasts and market days offered rare but crucial respite. During these times, peasants could trade surplus goods, acquire rare items, and strengthen social bonds. Markets also served as channels for news, political information, and gossip, creating networks that extended beyond the manor. These interactions provided subtle leverage, allowing ordinary people to navigate both scarcity and obligation more effectively. Even in a system dominated by hierarchy, opportunities existed to exercise agency and preserve autonomy. The physical environment remained a constant influence. Soil fertility, rainfall, and seasonal cycles dictated labor schedules and harvest success. Infrastructure such as mills, bridges, and irrigation ditches required ongoing maintenance, often organized collectively. When crops failed or livestock died, the pressure to meet obligations intensified, forcing households to make difficult decisions: ration food, negotiate with overseers, or seek temporary relief. Survival depended on careful observation, foresight, and cooperation skills honed through years of experience and transmitted across generations. As you step back, the manor emerges as a complex ecosystem of interdependence. Peasants worked the land, managed households, and negotiated obligations. Overseers enforced authority and mediated disputes. Lords relied on these structures to maintain wealth, security, and influence. What appears mundane, the tilling of soil, the spinning of wool, the repair of fences, is, in fact, the invisible machinery that sustained an entire social order. Every action, however small, contributed to the stability, productivity, and resilience of the manor. Yet questions remain. How did this system respond to external shocks, such as famine, disease, or war? What strategies allowed peasants to survive when obligations exceeded capacity? And how did the tension between labor, duty, and personal survival shape the evolution of rural life and social norms in medieval Europe? These unresolved issues prepare the ground for the final section of this story, where we explore the climax of manorial dynamics, the pressures that tested resilience, and the ways in which ordinary lives shaped the long-term course of European society. As you move toward the end of the story of life on the manor, the quiet rhythm of labor and obligation begins to reveal its pressures and tensions. The system that sustained medieval Europe was delicate, built on cumulative effort and constant negotiation. While the manor's daily routines were predictable, external forces, famine, disease, war, and political change could disrupt this fragile equilibrium. Peasants, stewards, and lords alike were constantly testing the limits of survival and adaptation. One of the most persistent challenges came from agricultural risk. Poor harvests caused by drought, flooding, or pestilence threatened both the peasant household and the lord's income. When crops failed, families had to ration food, seek alternative employment, or borrow from neighbors. Obligations to the lord remained, creating intense pressure. Some households faced fines or additional labor requirements, while others were able to negotiate partial relief, relying on social networks and precedent. These episodes reveal the subtle agency of ordinary people. Survival often depended on careful diplomacy, strategic planning, and communal cooperation. Disease posed another existential threat. Outbreaks of smallpox, dysentery, or influenza could decimate households, leaving labor shortages that affected both production and tribute. In response, peasants sometimes relied on shared labor, communal childcare, or pooling resources to weather crises. Lords and stewards had to adjust expectations and redistribute labor, balancing the enforcement of obligations with the practical need to maintain production. The interdependence of households, labor, and social order meant that crises tested not only individual resilience but the structural flexibility of the manor itself. Conflict, too, left its mark. Local disputes, rivalries between families, and tensions over land or resources could escalate, sometimes drawing in manorial courts for resolution. Broader conflicts such as raids, feudal wars, or political upheavals disrupted the daily rhythm, conscripting men into armies and leaving estates temporarily understaffed. Survival required adaptation. Peasants had to adjust planting schedules, care for vulnerable livestock, and negotiate with authorities. Even in the midst of monotony, life on the manor demanded constant vigilance and improvisation. Yet alongside these pressures existed mechanisms of resilience. Peasants and households developed strategies to manage scarcity and risk. Crop diversification, rotational farming, and careful storage reduced vulnerability. Bartering and market participation allowed acquisition of essential goods. Social networks, family ties, neighborly cooperation, and village leadership provided support during hardship. These practices demonstrate the ingenuity of ordinary people. Survival was not passive endurance but active, strategic engagement, with a system that demanded compliance and creativity in equal measure. The manor also left a lasting imprint on European society. By embedding labor, obligation, and negotiation into daily life, it shaped social norms, economic practices, and community structures. Practices such as collective resource management, local dispute resolution, and seasonal labor organization became enduring features of rural life. Even as feudalism gradually declined with economic, political, and technological changes, the patterns established on the manor influenced emerging village communities, property arrangements, and social expectations. The mundane labor of peasants tilling, harvesting, repairing, weaving became the foundation for centuries of societal continuity. Religion reinforced both order and resilience. Church attendance, tithes, and festival participation connected daily labor with spiritual meaning. Rituals marked agricultural cycles, celebrated communal achievements, and provided moral frameworks that justified obligations. Priests and monks also mediated conflicts, recorded agreements, and supported charitable activities, bridging the spiritual, social, and practical. In this sense, religion intertwined with survival, governance, and culture, shaping not only beliefs but also everyday decisions about labor, cooperation, and compliance. The manor's legacy is therefore both material and cultural. Roads, mills, field divisions, and water systems illustrate the practical knowledge embedded in rural life, while traditions of cooperation, negotiation, and resource management reflect the human strategies that sustained communities. Peasants were not powerless; they exercised influence through compliance, resistance, negotiation, and ingenuity. The manor was simultaneously a site of obligation and opportunity, hardship and adaptation, monotony and subtle creativity. As you reflect on life on the manor, you see that what might appear boring, planting wheat, repairing fences, tending livestock, is in fact the invisible mechanism that maintained an entire society. Ordinary people, through countless small acts of labor and negotiation, shaped the resilience of the feudal system and influenced its evolution over centuries. Their work demonstrates that history is not only forged in battles or court decrees, but in the quiet persistence of daily life, in the rhythms of labor, survival, and subtle social negotiation. And yet, the story leaves open questions. How did households respond when repeated crises strained their resources? How did the gradual decline of feudalism alter daily life and survival strategies on the manor? And how did the cumulative decisions of ordinary people shape the long-term trajectory of European rural society? These questions underscore the quiet, persistent power of the boring details of history the daily acts that form the foundation for entire civilizations. Story 4. Aztec markets and daily labor, ordinary life in Tenochtitlan. If you imagine stepping into Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, the first thing that strikes you is its sheer vibrancy. Built on islands in Lake Texcoco, the city is a network of causeways, canals, and bustling squares. Here, life unfolds around a pattern of daily labor, social obligations, and public exchange. Unlike the manorial villages of Europe, where work and hierarchy were localized, the capital pulses with commerce, civic duties, and ritual activity. Markets are not merely economic spaces, they are the heartbeat of the empire, connecting families, Calpuli, and the state itself. Walking through the Tlatelolco market, one of the largest in the Americas, you notice the diversity of goods: piles of maize, beans, and chili peppers, bundles of cotton cloth, intricately crafted obsidian tools, jaguar skins, brightly colored feathers, and cacao beans. Merchants call out prices, negotiate trades, and display wares in ways that are both practical and persuasive. Each item represents the labor of countless households, farmers, artisans, and traders whose work is coordinated through the Calpuli system. Markets serve as a microcosm of the empire. Ordinary people, working in familiar roles, collectively sustain the wealth, culture, and power of the state. Daily life in Tenochtitlan revolves around labor obligations, both civic and household. Men may spend mornings tending Chinempa's floating gardens that produce maize, beans, squash, and flowers before moving into the city to sell surplus at the market. Women manage households, prepare food, weave textiles, and maintain gardens or craft workshops. Children learn from observing adults, assisting in small tasks that teach essential skills for survival and social integration. Labor is structured, predictable, and yet varied, requiring both physical effort and practical knowledge of the city's economy. Markets are not only centers of exchange but also hubs of social and political life. Here, families meet neighbors, exchange news, and learn about imperial policies or tribute requirements. Merchants act as intermediaries between distant regions, bringing goods from conquered provinces or neighboring cities. Prices fluctuate based on supply, season, and local demand, and households must make strategic choices about what to sell, what to keep, and how to negotiate. In this way, market participation is both economic necessity and a form of social intelligence, shaping relationships, prestige, and household survival. The state relies on this system of exchange to function. Tribute collected from Calpuli flows into the capital, providing food for the elite, ceremonial items for temples, and resources for the army. Market activity distributes these goods further, ensuring that ordinary citizens and workers remain fed and supplied. Households experience this integration directly. Their labor in the fields or workshops contributes not only to their own subsistence, but also to the broader functioning of the empire. Ordinary acts selling maize, weaving cloth, or bartering goods are part of a carefully orchestrated economic network. Religious and civic rituals intersect with market life. Merchants and laborers often pause for ceremonies, festivals, or offerings to gods associated with agriculture, trade, and fertility. Certain market days coincide with ritual calendars, blending spiritual observance with practical activity. Offerings, such as small portions of maize or crafted items, are contributed to temples, reinforcing both piety and civic duty. For ordinary people, work, faith, and empire are inseparable. Labor is a form of devotion, and survival depends on both skill and compliance with social and spiritual norms. Life in Tenochtitlan also demands careful management of time and resources. Households must balance tribute obligations, market participation, household labor, and civic or religious duties. Food must be produced, stored, and sold. Textiles must be woven to meet both domestic needs and tribute quotas. Children must be educated in skills necessary for their future roles. Efficiency, foresight, and cooperation are essential. Failure in any area can affect both immediate survival and long-term standing within the calpuli or the city. Despite the order and organization, tension is constant. Markets are competitive, and households must navigate fluctuating supply, changing prices, and demands from both state and family. Labor shortages, illness, or crop failure can disrupt household production, increasing pressure to meet obligations. Local leaders mediate disputes, enforce rules, and sometimes adjust quotas, reflecting the balance between imperial control and practical survival. Ordinary people must constantly adapt, demonstrating resilience, ingenuity, and social awareness. The everyday labor of Tenochtitlan's inhabitants may seem mundane, tending chinampas, selling maize, weaving textiles, but it is the backbone of one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas. Ordinary households, through coordinated work and market participation, sustain not only themselves but also the broader empire, enabling ceremonial life, military campaigns, and urban prosperity. In observing these routines, you recognize that the Aztec system depends as much on the mundane efforts of common people as on the actions of rulers or warriors. And yet, questions linger. How did households respond to fluctuations in supply, rising tribute obligations, or market competition? How did the demands of labor, trade, and ritual shape family strategies and social cohesion? And what role did ordinary labor play in the resilience and eventual vulnerabilities of the Aztec Empire? These questions prepare the way for the next section, where we explore the organization of labor, the enforcement of market and tribute obligations, and the strategies households use to navigate city life. Stepping deeper into Tenochtitlan, you begin to see the complex interplay between household labor, market activity, and tribute obligations that defined life in the Aztec capital. Unlike the European manor, where work was mostly local and tied to land, the city's economy depended on the coordination of countless households across neighborhoods and regions. Each household contributed to production, craft, and trade, while leaders enforced compliance and organized resources to sustain the empire's political, religious, and military functions. The organization of labor was meticulous. Households participated in multiple forms of work simultaneously. Men might spend the morning tending chinampas, irrigating crops, and harvesting maize or beans, then move to the market to sell surplus. Women managed the home, prepared food, spun cotton, wove textiles, or made crafts for both domestic use and tribute. Children learned essential skills by observation and participation, assisting with planting, preparing goods for market, and performing small errands. Labor was intergenerational, with knowledge transmitted orally and through practical experience, ensuring continuity in both skill and social responsibility. Markets served as both economic and administrative hubs. Merchants were responsible for transporting goods, establishing prices, and negotiating exchanges. At the same time, local officials monitored transactions to ensure tribute quotas were met. Household production fed directly into these obligations. For example, a family weaving cotton cloth might supply both the marketplace for trade and the state as part of the calpuli's tribute. Failure to meet quotas could result in fines, additional labor, or even intervention by military officials. Thus, ordinary labor was inseparable from civic and imperial obligations. Tribute enforcement extended beyond mere collection. Inspectors, sometimes accompanied by warriors, periodically visited calpuli to verify compliance, record contributions, and ensure proper organization of households. These inspections were both practical and symbolic, reinforcing the presence of the state in daily life. Households prepared meticulously. Surplus goods were counted, records were maintained, and labor was coordinated to meet deadlines. Even minor errors could provoke penalties, so ordinary families learned strategies to minimize risk, such as careful accounting, coordination with neighbors, or prioritizing high-value contributions. The market itself created additional pressures and opportunities. Competition was constant. Prices fluctuated according to supply, demand, and seasonal variations. Households had to decide which goods to sell, which to reserve for consumption, and which to allocate to tribute. Strategic decision-making was essential. Some families specialized in particular goods, textiles, maize, obsidian tools, allowing them to gain prestige, command higher prices, or fulfill tribute quotas more efficiently. Others diversified production to spread risk and maintain stability. Everyday choices in production, sale, and exchange shaped household resilience, determining whether families could survive and even thrive under the city's demanding system. Social networks and communal cooperation were equally vital. Households often pooled labor for planting or harvesting, shared resources, or coordinated market schedules. Elders and Kalpali leaders mediated disputes, organized collective tasks, and ensured that obligations were distributed fairly. These networks functioned as informal insurance systems, providing support when shortages or crises struck. Survival in Tenochtitlan depended not only on individual skill, but also on the ability to navigate relationships, alliances, and obligations within the neighborhood and the broader urban system. Religious life further intertwined with labor and markets. Offerings to temples, participation in festivals, and ritual preparation of goods reinforced the moral and civic significance of everyday work. Maize or cotton might be dedicated to gods, while craftsmen produced ceremonial items for festivals. Ritual calendars structured labor patterns, ensuring that households synchronized production with civic and spiritual duties. In this way, work became a form of devotion, and survival was not only practical but morally and socially significant. Yet tension remained constant. Crop failures, illness, or injury could disrupt a household's ability to meet obligations, while fluctuating market prices or competition added uncertainty. Households had to anticipate problems, adapt quickly, and sometimes negotiate leniency with local leaders. Ordinary people developed subtle strategies, producing higher quality goods to offset lower quantities, coordinating work with neighboring families, or timing market participation to maximize advantage. These strategies reveal the agency of ordinary people, whose decisions shaped not only household survival, but also the functioning of the empire itself. The tribute and labor system also reinforced social hierarchy and mobility. Successful households gained prestige, while skilled artisans or merchants could earn recognition from leaders. Military service, integrated into neighborhood obligations, offered another pathway for advancement. Ordinary people understood that reliability, skill, and social cooperation mattered. Compliance alone was not enough. Strategic effort, timing, and adaptation allowed some families to improve their standing within the Kalpali and the city at large. In observing Tenochtitlan's markets and labor routines, you see that the apparent mundane work, planting maize, weaving textiles, selling goods, is in fact the lifeblood of the empire. Ordinary households were essential to sustaining urban life, religious ceremonies, and state functions. Their labor connected the city to distant regions, to the imperial tribute network, and to the material and spiritual well-being of the Aztec world. Yet questions remain unresolved. How did households cope when tribute demands increased or when market pressures intensified? How did ordinary labor shape the long-term resilience or vulnerability of the empire? And how did the interaction of household strategy, civic duty, and imperial authority define the daily experience of survival in the capital? These questions set the stage for the final section, where we explore the consequences of tribute enforcement, social hierarchy, and the lived realities of ordinary life in Tenochtitlan. As we draw the story of Tenochtitlan's markets and daily labor to a close, the city emerges not just as a capital, but as a complex ecosystem, sustained by the coordinated efforts of countless households. The brilliance of the Aztec system lies in its integration of labor, tribute, and civic participation, creating a network in which ordinary people, often invisible in historical narratives, form the backbone of urban and imperial life. Yet this network was not without its pressures and vulnerabilities. Tribute obligations remained a constant source of tension. Households were expected to supply agricultural goods, textiles, crafted items, and even labor for civic projects. Inspectors and local leaders enforced compliance rigorously, and failure could result in fines, additional duties, or punitive actions. These pressures intensified during periods of poor harvests, disease, or market disruptions, requiring households to adapt quickly. Families developed strategies to navigate scarcity, producing high-quality goods to meet quotas efficiently, sharing labor within the extended household, coordinating with neighbors for market access, and carefully timing deliveries to comply with imperial expectations. Survival demanded ingenuity as much as diligence. Markets were both opportunity and challenge. While competition could be fierce and prices fluctuated, participation allowed households to secure essential goods, exchange surplus, and gain prestige within the calpuli. Skilled artisans or traders could distinguish themselves, gaining recognition and occasionally advancing their social standing. For ordinary people, economic engagement was never purely transactional. It was intertwined with civic duty, ritual obligations, and survival strategy. The ability to navigate these overlapping spheres determined a household's resilience. Daily life also carried an embedded moral and spiritual dimension. Work, production, and market participation were not simply economic activities, they were acts of devotion to the gods and to the state. Maize, cotton, and crafted goods contributed to temple offerings, festivals, and civic ceremonies, linking personal labor to cosmic and civic order. In this way, ordinary households experienced their obligations as both necessary for survival and meaningful within the moral and social framework of the empire. Labor was practical, strategic, and sacred all at once. The urban environment amplified the stakes of daily survival. High population density meant that shortages, disease, or social tension could ripple quickly through neighborhoods. Water management, sanitation, and infrastructure maintenance were communal responsibilities, often coordinated through the calpuli. Cooperation was essential, and households had to negotiate obligations with both leaders and neighbors. Success depended on careful coordination, foresight, and the ability to adapt to unexpected challenges. Ordinary decisions how to allocate labor, when to sell goods, how to prepare tribute had far-reaching consequences for both family and community stability. Military service further intertwined with everyday labor. Men from households trained for warfare, participated in campaigns, or served in defensive duties, often at the expense of household productivity. Successful campaigns reinforced imperial control and could bring rewards to families, while failure increased obligations or risked punishment. In this way, the physical labor of farming, crafting, and trading was inseparable from the broader mechanisms of imperial authority and survival. Ordinary households were both producers and defenders of the state. Despite these pressures, Tenochtitlan thrived because ordinary people were resourceful, cooperative, and adaptive. Labor, market participation, and tribute were part of a carefully balanced system in which civic, spiritual, and economic duties intersected. The city's resilience depended not on rulers alone, but on the countless small acts of coordination, skill, and negotiation performed daily by ordinary households. The success of the empire, its ceremonies, markets, and military campaigns, was inseparable from this hidden labor. The legacy of Tenochtitlan's markets and labor extends far beyond its fall. It demonstrates the centrality of ordinary households in sustaining complex societies, the integration of practical, civic, and spiritual life, and the strategies that people develop to navigate obligations and scarcity. The city was a living testament to the ways in which boring, labor the planting of maize, weaving of textiles, or selling at a market stall, forms the foundation of civilization. Ordinary people, through resilience and ingenuity, shaped the strength, organization, and durability of the Aztec Empire. And yet, questions linger. How did these everyday systems respond to crises like conquest, disease, or famine? How did households, strategies for survival influence the long-term cohesion or vulnerability of the city? And what can the rhythms of daily life in Tenochtitlan teach us about the invisible labor that sustains all complex societies? In these questions, we see that the seemingly mundane details of daily life carry immense historical weight, shaping both the success and fragility of empires. Story 5. The Manor Economy, Trade, Tax, and Subsistence in Medieval Europe. If you step onto a medieval manor, you are entering a microcosm of economic activity that sustains an entire social hierarchy. Beyond the obvious labor in fields and pastures, the manor functions as a carefully balanced system of production, exchange, and obligation. Here, subsistence is not a simple matter of survival. It is a constant negotiation between household needs, labor demands, and obligations to the Lord. Understanding this economic ecosystem requires examining how trade, taxation, and everyday work intersected to maintain both family survival and the broader feudal order. At the center of the manor is the domain, the portion of land reserved for the Lord's direct use. Households work these fields several days per week, performing tasks ranging from plowing and sowing to harvesting and repairing infrastructure. In return, they are allowed to cultivate their own plots, known as tenancies, to provide for their families. The produce from these plots is essential for household survival. Maize, wheat, barley, oats, vegetables, and small livestock are managed carefully to ensure food security through the seasons. Trade within and beyond the manor provides additional resources. Local markets allow peasants to exchange surplus produce, craft goods, or textiles for items they cannot produce themselves. Occasionally, traveling merchants bring luxury items, salt, spices, or iron tools that households might barter for with a portion of their own production. Even in a largely subsistence-based economy, trade introduces variability and opportunity. Households must decide carefully what to allocate for their own use, what to sell, and what to set aside for obligations, balancing risk and reward in every season. Taxation, both secular and religious, adds another layer of obligation. Lords require rents, often paid in kind or labor, while the church demands tithes, commonly a tenth of produce or livestock. Meeting these requirements is not optional. Failure can result in fines, confiscation of goods, or additional labor demands. Households develop strategies to manage these pressures. Careful record-keeping, cooperation with neighbors, and timing of harvests to ensure obligations are met. The economic system is thus not only a structure of production, but a network of obligations that shapes daily life. Within the household, labor is carefully organized. Men typically manage the heavier agricultural work, plowing, tending livestock, and maintaining infrastructure such as fences, mills, and roads. Women contribute through domestic labor, food preparation, textile production, and childcare, often supplementing household income by selling or trading goods in local markets. Children participate early, assisting with simple chores that gradually teach skills essential for survival. Knowledge is passed down experientially. Children learn by observing, imitating, and participating, ensuring the continuity of both practical skill and cultural expectation. The manor also relies on communal cooperation to maintain productivity. Shared pastures, meadows, forests, and mills require coordination. Villagers organize labor for maintenance, grazing schedules, and wood collection. Festivals and holy days provide moments of both respite and coordination, structuring agricultural cycles while reinforcing social cohesion. These shared practices mitigate individual risk and reinforce community resilience, illustrating the interdependence of households within the manor. Survival is an ongoing calculation. Each household must anticipate crop yields, labor requirements, and obligations to lord and church. Poor harvests, illness, or environmental disruption can threaten food security. In response, families employ strategies such as crop diversification, careful storage, and cooperative labor arrangements. Peasants also navigate subtle negotiations with stewards or bailiffs, sometimes seeking leniency or arranging alternative labor to meet obligations. Ordinary households are thus engaged in a continuous exercise of resource management, negotiation, and social intelligence. The physical environment profoundly shapes economic decisions. Soil fertility, rainfall patterns, and the layout of fields determine what crops can be grown and how they are rotated to maintain yields. Livestock require careful management, both for sustenance and as a form of wealth and labor. Roads, bridges, and mills facilitate local trade and the transport of goods to larger markets, creating interconnections beyond the manor itself. Success depends on understanding both the natural and social environment, linking survival to knowledge, skill, and cooperation. Religion reinforces economic and social norms. Church tithes not only extract resources, but also provide moral and social frameworks, mediating disputes, supporting the poor, and structuring village life. Rituals tied to agricultural cycles mark planting, harvest, and seasonal change, connecting spiritual observance with practical labor. In this way, economic, civic, and spiritual life are intertwined, shaping not only survival but also the social fabric of the community. In examining the manor economy, it becomes clear that boring details how grain is measured, livestock managed, or labor divided are essential to the functioning of medieval society. Ordinary households, through careful management of production, trade, and obligations, sustain both themselves and the larger social hierarchy. Their labor, knowledge, and ingenuity form the backbone of feudal Europe, demonstrating that survival is both a practical and social endeavor. And yet, questions linger. How did households cope with repeated stress from poor harvests or heavy taxation? How did trade, barter, and market participation influence resilience and social mobility? And how did the combined pressures of labor, obligation, and environmental risk shape the long-term structure of rural life? These questions prepare the way for the next section, where we explore the strategies, conflicts, and adaptations that define the daily economic life of medieval peasants. As we delve deeper into the manor economy, it becomes clear that survival was as much about negotiation, planning, and strategy as it was about labor itself. Ordinary households were constantly balancing multiple demands, producing enough food to sustain themselves, meeting obligations to the lord and the church, and participating in trade or markets to secure additional goods. Every decision, from which crops to plant to when to sell surplus, had consequences for both household stability and social standing. One of the central pressures was the domain labor obligation. Serfs were often required to work several days per week on the lord's land, performing intensive tasks such as plowing, sowing, harvesting, or repairing infrastructure. While the schedule was predictable, the physical demand was immense, particularly during peak agricultural seasons. Households responded by organizing labor within the family. Men undertook heavier field work, women managed domestic production and craft work, and older children assisted in lighter tasks. Cooperation within the household was essential. Inefficiency or neglect could result in fines or punishment. Trade and market participation offered both opportunities and risks. Surplus produce, textiles, or crafted goods could be sold or bartered at local markets, providing access to items the household could not produce: salt, iron tools, or specialized cloth. Markets were also hubs for information, prices, news of harvests in neighboring villages, or opportunities for employment beyond the manor. Households that mastered these networks gained flexibility and resilience, while those less adept risked scarcity. Strategic timing, selling goods when demand was high, buying when supply was low, was critical. These mundane decisions often determined whether a family survived lean years or thrived. Obligations to the Lord and church were constant sources of tension. Rent, tithes, and other forms of taxation extracted a portion of the household's production. Compliance was enforced by stewards or bailiffs, whose oversight could be strict or occasionally negotiable depending on circumstances. Peasants developed strategies to manage these pressures: careful storage of surplus for emergencies, allocating higher quality goods to meet tribute obligations, and negotiating schedules for labor or payment. The ability to anticipate, adapt, and cooperate was as important as physical labor itself. Conflict and negotiation also shaped the manor economy. Disputes over land boundaries, grazing rights, or labor obligations were common, and manorial courts provided a venue for resolution. Knowledge of customary law and precedents could influence outcomes, giving households a degree of agency even within a rigid hierarchy. Cooperation and alliance within the village, sharing labor, pooling resources, or supporting one another in disputes, became crucial strategies for resilience. Ordinary people were constantly balancing compliance, negotiation, and adaptation to sustain both household and community stability. Environmental factors added another layer of complexity. Soil fertility, rainfall, and seasonal changes dictated planting schedules and crop rotation strategies. Poor harvests or livestock losses could threaten survival, forcing households to make difficult decisions: ration food, adjust labor contributions to the domain, or borrow from neighbors. Long-term success depended on understanding both the natural environment and the social systems governing production and exchange. Households developed knowledge over generations, combining experience, observation, and communal wisdom to navigate uncertainty. Religion intertwined with economics and survival. Tithes, church festivals, and rituals structured both time and labor. Agricultural activities were often linked to religious observances, ensuring that work, spiritual duty, and social compliance reinforced one another. Church authorities sometimes mediated disputes, offered relief during crises, or recorded agreements, creating an additional support system within the village. Survival was thus embedded in a network of labor, obligation, and belief, a holistic system that required skill, strategy, and cooperation. Even within this tightly regulated system, there were avenues for ingenuity. Households might specialize in particular crafts, like weaving or blacksmithing, creating goods for both market and tribute. Others diversified production, balancing agriculture with livestock, craft, or trade. By observing market fluctuations, negotiating with stewards, or pooling labor with neighbors, families could increase their resilience. Survival was not passive. It was an active process of adaptation to ever-changing social, economic, and environmental conditions. In examining the manor economy, one sees that what might appear mundane, harvesting grain, repairing fences, trading in markets, was the very foundation of feudal society. Ordinary households, through coordination, strategy, and resilience, sustained both themselves and the hierarchical structure above them. Labor alone was not sufficient. Survival required intelligence, foresight, cooperation, and careful navigation of obligations. Yet questions remain unresolved. How did households respond when multiple crises, poor harvests, illness, taxation, or conflict coincided? How did trade networks, communal cooperation, and household strategy influence long-term stability or social mobility? And how did the cumulative actions of ordinary people shape the persistence or evolution of the feudal system? These questions prepare the way for the final section, where we explore the consequences, adaptations, and broader implications of life in the manor economy. As we conclude the story of the manor economy, the intricate interplay of labor, trade, and obligations becomes clear. Life on the manor was often repetitive and physically demanding, But beneath the apparent monotony lay an extraordinary web of strategies, adaptations, and subtle negotiations. Survival was never automatic. It depended on the ingenuity of ordinary households, their ability to navigate social hierarchies, and their responsiveness to environmental and economic challenges. One of the greatest challenges came from the unpredictability of agriculture. Poor weather, floods, droughts, or pest infestations could devastate harvests. A single failed season might threaten food security, compromise the ability to pay rent or tithes, and push households to ration carefully or seek alternative work. Peasants responded with an array of strategies: crop diversification to spread risk, careful storage of surplus, and coordinated labor with neighbors to maximize efficiency. Household resilience was built on foresight, experience, and careful management of resources. Trade and market participation provided both a lifeline and a challenge. Surplus goods could be sold or bartered to acquire essential items that could not be produced on the manor, such as iron tools, salt, or luxury items like spices and fine cloth. Strategic decisions about when and what to sell allowed households to buffer themselves against scarcity, pay obligations, or accumulate modest reserves. Successful management of market interactions often meant the difference between merely surviving and maintaining relative stability, or even gaining prestige within the village community. Obligations to the Lord and Church remained constant pressures. Domain labor, rents, and tithe required careful planning and coordination. Households had to allocate labor and produce efficiently, prioritizing high-value contributions when necessary. Negotiation and subtle diplomacy played a crucial role. Steady compliance built trust with stewards and bailiffs, sometimes leading to leniency or flexibility during hard times. Ordinary families were not powerless. Their ability to navigate the system directly influenced their survival and, indirectly, the functioning of the manor as a whole. Conflict and cooperation coexisted. Disputes over land, grazing rights, or labor responsibilities were resolved in manorial courts, which often relied on precedent, custom, and negotiation. Cooperation within the village shared labor for harvests, pooling resources, or assisting households struck by misfortune was equally vital. Social cohesion was not incidental. It was a survival strategy, ensuring that households could withstand environmental stress, economic pressure, or unexpected crises. Everyday collaboration underpinned both subsistence and the stability of the broader feudal system. Environmental and technological knowledge amplified resilience. Peasants understood soil fertility, crop rotation, and the timing of planting and harvest. They managed livestock to provide both sustenance and labor, maintained essential infrastructure like roads, mills, and fences, and prepared for seasonal changes that could affect productivity. Knowledge accumulated across generations was practical, detailed, and essential. Failure to heed it could result in serious consequences for household survival. Religion provided both structure and support. Tithes, religious observances, and seasonal festivals connected labor and obligations to moral and spiritual frameworks. The church mediated disputes, recorded agreements, and sometimes provided aid during famine or hardship. Work, piety, and community were intertwined, creating a system in which survival was simultaneously a practical, social, and moral endeavor. Household labor, in this sense, became a vehicle for continuity, both in sustaining life and in maintaining social order. The legacy of the manor economy is profound. It demonstrates how ordinary households, through careful labor, strategic planning, and social cooperation, sustain both themselves and a broader hierarchical system. The boring details of daily life, planting grain, spinning wool, repairing fences, trading at local markets, were in fact the invisible mechanisms that allowed feudal society to function over centuries. These routines shaped not only survival strategies, but also social norms, community cohesion, and the long-term evolution of rural European society. Ultimately, life on the manor illustrates that resilience is built not only in response to extraordinary events, but through the accumulation of countless mundane choices, coordinated labor, and adaptive strategies. Ordinary households, by navigating obligations, environmental risk, and economic pressures, became both the stabilizing force of feudal society and the agents of its gradual transformation. And yet questions remain. How did households respond when crises multiplied, such as war, plague, or famine? How did their strategies influence broader social mobility or the eventual decline of feudalism? And what lessons can the detailed study of mundane survival teach about the persistence of human ingenuity and resilience in complex social systems? In these questions, we see that the apparently ordinary labor of the past carries extraordinary historical significance. Story 6. The everyday life of Aztec farmers, agriculture, family, and community. If you imagine the Aztec countryside surrounding Tenochtitlan, your mind may picture vast swaths of Chinempa's artificial islands carefully constructed on the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco. These floating gardens are the foundation of Aztec agriculture, a marvel of engineering and labor that sustains not only the urban population but the entire empire. Life on the Chinempas is structured, demanding, and deeply communal, with each household contributing both to its own survival and to the broader obligations of the Calpulli. Households in rural and peri-urban areas were highly organized. Men typically undertook the heavier labor of digging canals, piling fertile soil, planting maize, beans, and squash, and tending canals to ensure irrigation. Women managed household gardens, processed food, prepared maize tortillas, wove textiles, and maintained domestic spaces. Children were integrated early into these routines, learning by observation and participation, carrying water, weeding, or assisting in planting. Knowledge was transmitted practically, generation to generation, embedding both skill and cultural expectation into daily life. The Chinempas themselves were highly productive yet labor-intensive. Small plots were divided among households, often measuring only a few meters wide but stretching hundreds of meters long. Fertility was maintained by layering mud, reeds, and organic matter, a practice that required both planning and physical effort. Crops were rotated to prevent soil depletion, and the canals ensured constant water supply, reducing risk of drought but requiring maintenance to prevent flooding. The daily rhythm of work was dictated by the agricultural calendar: planting, tending, weeding, harvesting, and storing, with little room for error. Labor was coordinated not just within households but across the Calpulli. Certain tasks, such as clearing canals or repairing irrigation channels, were communal, requiring the participation of multiple families. Coordination was often organized by local leaders, and participation was both a practical necessity and a civic duty. These cooperative efforts reinforced social cohesion, built mutual reliance, and ensured that resources critical to the survival of the community were maintained. Ordinary work thus carried both personal and communal significance. Markets connected rural labor to the urban economy. Surplus maize, beans, and vegetables were transported to Tenochtitlan, where they could be traded or delivered as tribute. The success of these efforts depended on careful planning. Households needed to produce enough to feed themselves, fulfill Calpulli obligations, and contribute to tribute quotas. Failure in any of these domains could threaten social standing, household stability, or compliance with the empire's requirements. Agriculture was thus both a means of subsistence and a way to participate in a larger social and political system. Households also practiced resource management to cope with uncertainty. Crops were stored carefully, often in granaries or elevated structures to prevent spoilage or flooding. Livestock, turkeys, dogs, ducks, or bees provided protein, labor, or honey, supplementing household diets. Families diversified production to spread risk. Different crops, multiple garden plots, and integration of fishing or small-scale hunting allowed flexibility in lean years. Survival was never taken for granted. It required foresight, planning, and daily diligence. The social fabric of the Calpuli was deeply intertwined with agriculture. Leaders mediated disputes, coordinated labor, and organized festivals and rituals that reinforced both religious and civic duty. Families contributed offerings to temples, celebrated planting and harvest festivals, and participated in ceremonies that marked seasonal and agricultural milestones. Work, devotion, and social life were inseparable, creating a rhythm in which ordinary households were central to both production and culture. Even mundane routines, planting maize, repairing canal walls, preparing tortillas, or carrying water, are essential to understanding the Aztec Empire. Ordinary households, through persistent labor and coordination, sustained not only their own survival but also the flow of tribute, the functioning of markets, and the cohesion of the Calpuli. Their daily practices shape both local and imperial life, demonstrating that the apparent ordinary work of farmers is, in fact, foundational to one of the most sophisticated societies in pre-Columbian America. And yet, questions remain. How did households respond when crops failed or labor obligations increased? How did families negotiate resource allocation, tribute, and social responsibilities? And how did the daily practices of ordinary farmers influence the resilience and vulnerabilities of the Aztec agricultural system? These questions prepare us for the next section, where we will explore the pressures, strategies, and adaptations of rural life in the Aztec world. As we move deeper into the daily life of Aztec farmers, it becomes clear that survival on the Chinampas required more than skill in planting or harvesting. Households constantly balanced agricultural labor, tribute obligations, and family needs, while navigating social expectations and environmental constraints. Every action, from managing soil fertility to coordinating work with neighbors, was part of a careful strategy to maintain household stability and fulfill civic and religious duties. Tribute was a constant concern. The Aztec state required Calpuli to provide quotas of maize, beans, textiles, or other goods, which were collected periodically and transported to Tenochtitlan. Inspectors ensured compliance, and failure could result in fines, additional labor, or social sanction. For households, this meant that daily agricultural work had dual purposes: feeding the family and meeting the demands of the empire. The pressure was particularly intense during peak agricultural seasons, when households needed to simultaneously harvest, process, and prepare goods for tribute delivery. Labor coordination within households was essential. Men often undertook the heavier physical tasks of digging canals, hauling soil, and plowing plots, while women managed domestic production, prepared food, and wove cloth or mats for household use and tribute. Children contributed by fetching water, tending small livestock, or assisting in planting and weeding. Knowledge of effective labor allocation, timing, and task sequencing was passed down orally, ensuring that every family member understood their role in both survival and civic duty. Efficient households could meet obligations while still maintaining food security and social standing. Cooperation across the Calpuli amplified resilience. Certain labor tasks, repairing irrigation channels, clearing canals, or building communal storage, required multiple families to participate. Local leaders coordinated schedules, assigned responsibilities, and mediated disputes, ensuring that the community functioned smoothly. Households developed strategies to manage these obligations, such as sharing labor with neighboring families, rotating responsibilities, or pooling resources to meet collective needs. In these arrangements, ordinary households exercised agency, negotiating both compliance and efficiency within a hierarchical structure. Environmental unpredictability added further complexity. Crop failures due to drought, pests, or flooding could threaten survival and increase the difficulty of meeting tribute obligations. Households responded through diversification, planting multiple crop types, maintaining small gardens for subsistence, integrating fishing or hunting, and keeping small livestock such as turkeys or ducks. Surplus was carefully stored in granaries or elevated platforms to prevent spoilage, ensuring that families could weather periods of scarcity. Survival was not passive endurance. It required continuous observation, planning, and adaptation to both environmental and social conditions. Markets also played a crucial role in rural household strategy. Surplus produce or crafted goods could be traded or sold to acquire items that households could not produce themselves, such as salt, obsidian tools, or textiles. Market participation allowed families to balance subsistence needs with tribute demands and provided an avenue for social networking, information exchange, and community cohesion. Strategic engagement with markets could improve resilience, offering flexibility during years of poor harvest or increased obligations. Religious practice intersected with daily labor. Planting and harvest festivals, offerings to deities such as Sentiatl, maize god, and Tlaloc, rain god, and participation in communal rituals reinforced the moral and civic dimensions of work. Labor was therefore both a practical necessity and a sacred duty, connecting household survival to broader cultural and spiritual frameworks. This integration of labor, belief, and obligation strengthened the resilience of both families and the Calpuli. Yet life on the Chinampas was not without tension. Labor was physically demanding, obligations could be overwhelming, and failures, whether environmental, economic, or social, could threaten both household survival and social standing. Households developed strategies to cope, prioritizing high-value crops for tribute, coordinating labor across family members and neighbors, timing tasks to align with festivals or inspections, and diversifying production to reduce risk. Survival was a constant exercise in observation, decision-making, and adaptation. In observing the daily life of Aztec farmers, it becomes clear that the ordinary labor of planting, harvesting, tending canals, and managing households is anything but insignificant. These actions sustained families, contributed to tribute flows, enabled market networks, and reinforced the social and spiritual cohesion of the Calpuli. Ordinary households were not merely passive participants, they were central agents in maintaining both local and imperial stability. And yet, questions remain. How did families adapt when consecutive years of poor harvest or environmental disruption coincided with rising tribute demands? How did household strategies shape long-term resilience or vulnerability within the Calpuli? And how did the labor, coordination, and ingenuity of ordinary farmers influence the broader trajectory of Aztec society? These questions set the stage for the next section, where we examine the outcomes of these pressures, the adaptations households employed, and the lasting lessons from everyday life on the Chinampas. As we conclude the story of Aztec farmers, the intricate web of labor, family coordination, and community cooperation becomes clear. Life on the Chinampas was demanding and structured, but it was also a site of resilience, ingenuity, and subtle agency. Households navigated environmental uncertainty, tribute obligations, and social expectations, and through these daily strategies, they sustained not only themselves but the broader Aztec state. The ordinary work of planting maize, weaving textiles, and maintaining canals was foundational to the empire's strength, functioning as the invisible engine of urban and ritual life. The pressures of tribute were constant. Calpuli were responsible for delivering quotas of food, textiles, and other goods to Tenochtitlan, and failure to meet these obligations could result in social sanctions, fines, or increased labor demands. Households responded through careful planning and labor allocation. High-value crops and goods were prioritized for tribute, while subsistence needs were met through diversified gardens and livestock. Coordination among family members and cooperation with neighbors allowed households to maximize productivity without compromising survival. Ordinary Aztec families understood that success depended not only on physical effort, but on strategic decision-making and social negotiation. Environmental challenges required similar ingenuity. Droughts, floods, pests, and disease threatened crops and livestock, and households had to adapt quickly to maintain both food security and tribute compliance. Strategies included planting multiple crop varieties, maintaining elevated granaries, integrating aquaculture and small livestock, and pooling labor with neighbors to meet critical deadlines. Every decision was informed by observation, experience, and a deep understanding of the environment. Ordinary farmers became expert managers of uncertainty, skillfully balancing risk and reward in their daily routines. Markets provided another avenue for resilience and flexibility. Surplus produce and crafted goods could be traded for essential items or luxury products, allowing households to mitigate shortfalls or accumulate resources. Participation in markets also reinforced social networks, facilitated the exchange of information, and provided insight into regional economic trends. Farmers were thus not isolated laborers. They were active participants in a dynamic system of production, exchange, and social engagement that connected rural life with the capital and beyond. Religious life reinforced both labor and social cohesion. Offerings to maize gods, rain deities, and other figures linked household productivity to spiritual obligations. Festivals and ritual cycles structured work schedules, ensuring that agricultural tasks were aligned with civic and religious calendars. In this sense, labor was never purely practical, it was embedded in moral, spiritual, and social frameworks that strengthened the cohesion of the calpuli. Ordinary families were simultaneously economic actors, spiritual participants, and social agents, shaping both their own survival and the functioning of their communities. Even the most mundane tasks, digging canals, hauling soil, tending maize, preparing tortillas, were acts of resilience. Households that coordinated labor efficiently, diversified production, and participated in communal obligations ensured both survival and relative stability. Those strategies, repeated across generations, strengthened the broader social and economic structure of the Aztec Empire. Ordinary people, through persistent, disciplined labor and thoughtful adaptation, became the hidden architects of urban prosperity, military success, and imperial cohesion. The legacy of rural life on the Chinampas is profound. It demonstrates how ordinary labor can sustain complex societies, how households adapt to environmental and social pressures, and how coordinated action across families and communities forms the backbone of resilience. The Aztec state depended on these routines, and the empire's stability, wealth, and cultural achievements were inseparable from the daily efforts of its farmers. Boring tasks in this context reveal extraordinary significance. They are the foundation of survival, social cohesion, and imperial power. Yet questions remain. How did repeated crises, droughts, pests, or rising tribute affect the long-term strategies and cohesion of households? How did family labor and communal cooperation influence the empire's resilience or vulnerability? And what lessons can we draw from the intricate balance of ordinary work, obligation, and adaptation in shaping sustainable, resilient societies? These questions remind us that the small, repetitive actions of ordinary people often carry immense historical weight, shaping the trajectory of civilizations in ways that may be invisible in conventional histories. Story 7: Peasant Revolts and Resistance. Negotiating life under feudal lords. If you imagine a medieval manor, it may appear orderly at first. Neatly divided fields, organized labor schedules, and households performing their work in rhythmic repetition. Yet beneath this surface lies a constant tension. Peasants lived under obligations to their lord that shaped every aspect of daily life. Domain labor, rent in kind or money, tithes to the church, and fines for minor infractions. Survival depended not only on labor but on careful negotiation, compliance, and, at times, subtle resistance. Life under obligation was rarely static, it was a constant exercise in adaptation and occasionally defiance. The physical demands of labor were relentless. Peasants spent long days in the fields, tending crops, caring for livestock, and repairing infrastructure. Seasonal peaks, such as sowing or harvest, required intensive coordinated effort, often leaving little time for rest or secondary tasks. Women contributed through domestic labor, food preparation, and textile production, while children assisted with chores, gradually learning the skills necessary for adulthood. Every household member had a role, and inefficiency could have real consequences for survival and compliance with obligations. Obligations themselves were varied and layered. The Lord's domain required specific labor days, often supplemented by payments in kind or cash. Church tithes added another layer of extraction. Local officials, such as stewards or bailiffs, enforced compliance, and minor infractions could result in penalties. Even routine activities, like collecting firewood or grazing animals on common land, were regulated. Households had to navigate this complex system daily, balancing survival with expectation. Ordinary decisions how to allocate labor, which crops to reserve, how to negotiate fines were critical, shaping both immediate and long-term prospects. Resistance often emerged in subtle forms. Peasants might slow their work on the Lord's fields, hide or underreport surplus produce, or coordinate collective bargaining to reduce obligations. These actions were rarely violent but required careful social negotiation. Communities often relied on customary law and precedent to assert rights, sometimes petitioning manorial courts to dispute fines, labor requirements, or unfair treatment. Compliance, in this sense, was rarely passive. It was an ongoing negotiation between survival and the assertion of household and community interests. Markets, craftwork, and barter offered additional avenues for subtle resistance and resilience. By participating in local exchange, households could retain essential goods, redistribute surplus, or bypass certain obligations indirectly. Artisans and skilled laborers sometimes leveraged scarcity or high demand to negotiate better terms for themselves or their households. Even small acts trading slightly less than expected, adjusting harvest schedules, or rotating communal labor differently allowed peasants to exercise agency within a system designed to limit it. Environmental pressures added layers of complexity. Crop failure, livestock disease, or extreme weather could exacerbate the burden of obligations. In such circumstances, households had to make critical decisions, ration food, negotiate leniency with stewards, or seek temporary labor elsewhere. Survival was a delicate balancing act between meeting demands and maintaining household resilience. These pressures occasionally provoked collective action, ranging from petitions and strikes to outright rebellion, illustrating the limits of the feudal system's tolerance for hardship. Religion played a dual role, reinforcing both compliance and subtle negotiation. The Church's moral authority supported the social order, emphasizing duty, piety, and the proper fulfillment of obligations. At the same time, priests and local ecclesiastical courts occasionally mediated disputes, provided moral justification for leniency, or documented agreements, offering households additional tools to navigate pressures. Faith and daily labor were intertwined, shaping both household decision-making and community cohesion. Even mundane tasks, plowing, thrashing, spinning, repairing fences took on deeper significance when viewed through the lens of obligation and resistance. Ordinary labor became a site where households negotiated power, exercised agency, and ensured survival. The rhythms of work, compliance, and subtle defiance demonstrate that history is not only forged in grand battles or political decrees, but also in the persistent strategies of ordinary people managing their lives under constraint. Yet questions remain. How far could households push against obligations before provoking punishment? What strategies allowed communities to coordinate resistance effectively? And what factors determined whether revolts succeeded or failed? And how did the cumulative decisions of ordinary people shape the long-term evolution of rural life and feudal authority? These questions prepare us for the next section, where we will explore specific revolts, acts of resistance, and the consequences of defying feudal power. As we delve deeper into the life of peasants under feudal authority, it becomes clear that resistance was not limited to grand revolts. Much of it occurred in subtle, strategic ways, embedded within daily labor and household decision-making. Peasants constantly negotiated between survival, social expectations, and obligations imposed by lords and church authorities. Even small acts timing work, adjusting crop yields, or manipulating communal labor were forms of agency that shaped both individual and collective outcomes. One common form of subtle defiance was work packing. On the lord's domain, peasants might deliberately slow their efforts, feigning fatigue or misjudging productivity, to conserve energy for household labor or ensure sufficient subsistence. While risky, this tactic was often tolerated if it did not threaten the lord's immediate interests. Similarly, households might underreport yields, hiding surplus produce from stewards or allocating it strategically to meet both personal and communal needs. Such decisions required careful observation of official oversight, social dynamics, and the household's own needs. Barter, markets, and small-scale trade also served as tools of negotiation and resilience. By trading excess produce or crafted goods with neighbors or traveling merchants, households could acquire items otherwise unattainable through formal channels. Markets allowed for resource redistribution, buffer against scarcity, and subtle assertion of autonomy. A peasant weaving extra cloth or cultivating a surplus plot could use the market to supplement food or pay obligations on more favorable terms. These small acts, repeated across households, contributed to the stability and survival of the community even under feudal constraints. Sometimes, resistance escalated into organized revolt. While large-scale uprisings were relatively rare, they did occur when pressures became unsustainable: high taxes, excessive labor obligations, or widespread famine. Famous examples